Awesome. So we have another guest with us today. We have Clark Herman, and he's a B2B senior content marketing strategist and copywriter, and he's a content marketing strategist at Global Life Science Alliance, and he was previously a content marketing manager at Vibrant Health. Great to have you on the show, Clark. Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself, what you've been up to currently?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I would say I've had a long history of doing content writing, and in recent years, it's adapted more to, because of the copywriting aspect, working for B2B SaaS companies, especially in life sciences, doing work to kind of define what the product is and to do some research around the audience and how to effectively market to the audience. So I sort of sit at that sweet spot between content writing and content strategy and product marketing and product strategy.
Great. And how did you get into this space? What were you doing before this, and how did you end up here?
So I started out in PR when I went to school. I quickly learned that just wasn't creative enough for me. So I went into writing for a trade magazine called Pharmaceutical Executive Magazine. I did some work doing internal communications for Johnson & Johnson. And then from there, I wore a lot of different hats at a lot of different kinds of marketing companies, or a lot of different companies doing marketing, startup companies, smaller companies, mid-sized companies, some of the bigger companies. And over time, kind of developed a business for myself, doing some freelance work, and then also doing some full-time work for some companies, mainly, again, in life sciences and software as a service.
Correct. And please tell us a little bit about your current role, right? What it entails and what you've done so far in that space.
So a lot of what I'm doing currently is consulting clients in the life sciences SaaS space, particularly around, for instance, clinical trials, supply chain, or considering like insourcing people with particular credentials in life sciences. So it's been an opportunity to sort of deepen my knowledge of those industries, as particularly the niches within these industries. And as far as kind of some of the nitty gritty of what I'm doing, I'm trying to integrate AI into my workflow, and I'm trying to basically anticipate some of the challenges that will create for product marketing and content marketing more specifically.
Got it. Cool. And could you please start by explaining what message maps are and why they are crucial for successful content marketing? If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So message maps, I like to think of them as internal documents that compile messaging that can be used in different ways. For instance, in media interviews, they might come in handy for subject matter experts that want to use some talking points from the company into content or product marketing, especially. They're useful in things like press releases. So basically, they're internal documents that allow you to pick and choose your messaging and adapt it to different forms of content.
All right. And can you walk us through the process of using a message map to repurpose a single piece of content for multiple platforms? What does the workflow look like?
So I would say the first thing you really want to determine is what your objective is for a campaign that you're creating a message map around, and then determine kind of who are some of the key personas that you're going to be creating that campaign for, and are the personas are going to be mapped to specific pieces of content. If so, that's going to change a little bit in terms of how you create the message map. If you want it to be by persona, if you want it to be by piece of content, if you want it to be by specific features on a product, it can be segmented in different ways, and that's what's really versatile about it. And then from there, I mean, as long as you have a general idea of how you plan on repurposing your content, sometimes you could do it a little bit more spontaneous and on the fly, and think that, maybe, for instance, a webinar would be, you could do it as an infographic, you could do it as a blog. So, and I would say a lot of that process and that workflow is also figuring out the channels, because the channels are going to dictate what the content is and kind of who your audience is, and so therefore who you're going to be messaging to. So again, I would say start with like a big objective, determine some pieces of content that you would want to use it for, some personas or some audience segments, and then create the map from there. And then as you're repurposing, you can always improvise on the fly, and you can repurpose for different tactics as you go.
Right. Cool. And I was also wondering if you could walk us through a process which you follow when a client reaches you, right? What kind of problem statements do they come up with to you, and how do you go about helping them with those problems? If you could walk us through the process.
Sure. So for instance, we had one client that was trying to launch an app for pulmonologists and different types of physicians. And they wanted something that was going to be functioning to help their subject matter experts in the field to essentially be able to answer questions in a very detailed way, in a very science-backed way, so that they could have studies to support some of their thinking as to why the app was important for this particular type of physician. So again, we knew what our objective was starting out. We knew where our target persona was. And we knew that a lot of what the map was going to be structured towards was media interviews. So we structured it in terms of different types of audiences that it would be suitable for, because this person would be going to different trade publications to do interviews. Structuring it out that way made a lot of sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. Great. Again, coming back to the repurposing of content, how do you tailor repurposed content to suit the preferences of different audience segments while maintaining a consistent message?
Well, the one thing I really like to do with a company or client first is to get a clear understanding of a brand's story and their offering before creating content or messaging. That's really important because that's going to be sort of at the core of the message map. But then you're taking that messaging and you're kind of adapting it to different markets or different segments or with using different strategies. An example I like to give is, for instance, with a software as a service vendor, there's different kinds of brand identities that you can strike out in the market. There's maybe some SaaS companies that are more plug and play and they offer a very simple solution. And then there are vendors that do very custom work and they align their roadmap very, very closely with the capabilities that a particular client or a type of client would want. So that's an example of basically some core messaging around a product and its marketing that kind of dictates some of the messaging that you're going to be creating out in the market with content. Obviously you want to maintain some consistency as in terms of your brand and your offering, but then obviously you have to be able to adapt where, the message map is important to be versatile around different pieces of content, different channels, different audiences.
Correct, totally. And what are some of the challenges that you faced in repurposing content across different vehicles, and how have you overcome those challenges?
Well, I would bucket it into basically three different things. And this is largely from a content creation and content writing perspective. So the first would be taking big pieces of content or longer form pieces of content and being able to condense them and to cut what you don't need in order to repurpose for smaller pieces of content like blogs or social copy. So obviously that takes an eye for making sure that you're adapting the messaging to the channel in such a way that you're able to remove what's not necessary and what's really not going to resonate with a particular audience or in a particular channel. If you're taking a small piece of content, you're adapting it bigger. I don't like to do this as much as I would take a big piece and break it down into smaller components. But here, what you're doing is you're taking specific points and you're deepening on them and you're adding in points where it may be necessary. And that's kind of where a message map is really important, because if you have a large sort of brain dump of all this different material in the form of a message map, you can take from that material as you need it to effectively repurpose. And that's why message maps are so important. So the last piece I would speak to is the project management piece. So this is really in terms of being able to understand the demands of a campaign upfront and being able to determine the scheduling and be able to allocate resources properly. So this is pretty common in product marketing and content marketing, is just knowing how to run your schedule for different campaigns and knowing what resources you need to allocate to different projects and different repurposing.
Yeah. Got it. And how does repurposing the content contribute to extending the lifespan of your marketing materials? Can you maybe share a few success stories around this?
Yeah, sure. So in one case, when I wrote for the trade magazine, Pharmaceutical Executive Magazine, we did a featured article on medicines adherence, which is basically a fancy way of saying getting people to take their medication. So I interviewed a number of different key opinion leaders in this space. And one of them, who their primary research was to study medication adherence. And I was able to repurpose the interview that I did with her into a Q&A article where we kind of dove more specifically into some of the things that she studies. And I was also able to tap her as a resource on the issue sort of months and years down the line. This just goes to show you that you can take pieces of content where you've done a lot of research, and you can repurpose that or reuse that. And if you're tapping specific people for their opinion, then those are people that you can use down the line as resources. You can tap them for information, and you have those relationships to draw from. So I would say being able to repurpose is really a gift, because it does allow you to expand not just your knowledge set that you can use in different ways, but also to expand your Rolodex and to meet new people.
Yeah, totally. Great. And are there any specific tools or techniques that you find particularly useful in managing and implementing the message maps for content repurposing?
Well, I will stay pretty general here, but I will first say that AI is a really good tool for repurposing because it gives you idea. You can expand on messaging or adapt it to specific markets or personas. And it also gives you an opportunity to think more critically about your content. And then obviously project management software is really great because it can serve as a central repository for content, which is nice when maybe, for instance, you're building internal links to a blog. You can easily access all the content you have at your disposal for that kind of work. And it also just makes moving parts of repurposing a campaign easier so that you kind of know where everything is in your project management timelines. So having that kind of dashboard is really important when you're doing a lot of repurposing and you have a lot of moving parts.
Correct. So let's assume that you've got some 10 content pieces and you want to plan a repurposing campaign around those 10 pieces, right? So how would you go about, let's say, using the AI tool, ChatGPT or whatever? And what would your process look like when you are thinking about repurposing?
So you're saying 10 pieces of content and figuring out ways to repurpose them?
Yeah. How would you go about prioritizing which ones to repurpose and at what scale? Maybe some pieces you might want to repurpose in multiple formats, and some you would want to restrict to just one or two other forms, right? So how would you go about prioritizing them, and how would maybe AI come into the picture?
I would say probably one of the things I would try to work on is getting kind of the longest piece of content that I can, because the more data that you can feed generative AI, the better. So having a longer form piece that you can feed them, and then just say like, how would you repurpose this? If it's for a real estate audience and I want to repurpose it for maybe like a healthcare practice, I would just ask it for some considerations or maybe to rewrite a post, and I won't use entirely all that copy, but it will give me ideas as kind of how to effectively strategize and reposition for this different audience. Sometimes I'll ask it, maybe this is a software on two-way SMS, for instance, and I'm adapting it from maybe like a real estate audience to maybe more like a healthcare practice audience. Now I would ask, GPT or one of the generative AI platforms, what if I'm a healthcare practice manager, or if I'm a physician with a small private practice, what are some things that I would consider as it relates to two-way SMS? So, whereas real estate would want to consider two-way SMS to answer questions around applications and to schedule tours, there might be more considerations around, is the two-way SMS, is it compliant with healthcare regulations? Like in the US, we have a Privacy Act, which stipulates kind of when and where and how data can be shared as it relates to one's health. So plugging in those kinds of considerations or those kinds of questions into GPT or another generative AI allows you to kind of understand what maybe pieces of content that you could get out of it, considerations that a persona or an audience might think about that you wouldn't necessarily off the cuff think about. So it's great for brainstorming, I would say.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Definitely it does. Right. And also, how do you maintain creativity and freshness in your content when repurposing them for different platforms? So how do you go about doing that?
I would say, and this is kind of a writer thing that I'm suggesting, is really taking time and space from your content to come back with fresh eyes. Like the other day, I wrote a very long blog post for a client, and as much as I wanted to read it over then and there, I just said I should come back to this with fresh eyes and a fresh mind about this. So I think sometimes we can put a lot of pressure on ourselves, and to be able to come back, take some time away from a project and then come back, it'll give us more energy. We'll have more creativity to focus on a specific task as it relates to repurposing. And that kind of brings another point that I want, is don't force repurposing when it's not happening easily. Sometimes that can tell you a lot about whether a piece of content is going to be right for the particular medium or publication or audience set. If you're not getting a lot to speak about as it relates to a particular product or a particular use case or a particular persona that you're marketing to, then let sales do that work, or create, maybe some sales content, but you don't have to create much in the way of blog content. And again, if you feel like you need it, if the marketing team or the executive team feels like you need that persona work, then it's going to happen one way or another. The last point I want to make as it relates to this question is that message maps don't always have to be first. So sometimes they can come out of doing content. I started work for a client a year ago. They didn't have a lot of strategy and messaging mapped out. They didn't have a brand identity. So I wasn't comfortable doing that work until maybe 6 months into the job. And then I had a lot to say because I was already doing that work, creating the content. And so message maps sometimes come out of doing content first. And getting familiar with a particular brand or company or a client. And then they can be used to further create more content down the line. They can be used as guideposts to do some ideation or to frame out some of your campaigns going forward.
Totally. That makes a lot of sense. Right. And how do you go about measuring the success of your repurposed content? Are there certain metrics or KPIs that you prioritize?
Well, obviously it depends a lot on the campaign. But I would say the first thing I want to do is I want to get benchmark data. So for instance, if it's a webinar that we're doing work for, I want to know how many leads are we getting. And I want to see if I can, if it starts out at, in the last year, we've gotten 50 leads per webinar. I want to see if we can take it 70, 80 leads for, the next webinar, next couple webinars. The other thing I really like to look at is lead quality, because I think repurposed content can really deepen the quality of leads. So for instance, if you have somebody in real estate that's looking for a two-way SMS solution, you have an opportunity to build trust with that audience is if you're doing more content that's purposed specifically for that audience. Whereas if you're going more generally, you're not able to do that kind of persona work that builds the trust, builds the rapport, and speaks specifically to the use cases that persona or that market really connects to as a result of their day-to-day work. The other thing I look for is depth of engagement. So not just how many likes are we getting in shares, but are we getting interesting comments and questions? My hope is that when we're repurposing content for social media, that it's not only shareable, but that people are interacting with it in a way that they're asking questions, or they find particular pieces of like an interview like this or a webinar to be particularly insightful. I'm looking, the likes and, that popularity, but it's getting deeper engagement.
Yeah, right. Great. And I also wanted to speak to you about your experience as a freelancer, right? So how do you see this space as a freelancer? What are some of the good things about it? Maybe some of the not so good things about being a freelancer in this space. And if somebody were to get started with being a freelancer in this space, how would you suggest them?
Well, I would say a big part of becoming a freelancer is knowing what you're good at and knowing what you like to do. So finding companies and clients where your skills and what you like to do really align with some of the company clients that I love their work. I have some clients where it's in my wheelhouse, it's in my skill set, but it's not an area that I'm particularly excited by, or it's an area where maybe I'm sort of expanding my knowledge set or my skills. So, I think in any career, you get a mix of what you really, really love and stuff that maybe is going to expand your boundaries a little bit. So I would say find a good mix of that. Hopefully you can get more of the former, doing work you love for clients you love. And I'd say one of the things I've really learned from this process is that you'll learn through different projects and different clients what you like, what you don't like, the kind of terms that you want to be paid on, the kind of money that you want to make, the kind of projects that you want to do. And so at first it's okay not to know and to take some things that maybe feel like a little bit of a risk, or and that kind of brings me to another point is we're all faking it. So I've met people who were executive vice presidents and people who are high up in the corporate food chain that, revealed to me, like, I don't really know what I'm doing. So it became clear to me that most people have some form of imposter syndrome. Yeah. And it just comes down to, can you improvise? Can you make it look good? Because a lot of the work we do is, they don't necessarily see the behind the scenes and the struggle, but they do see the finished product. Yeah. And that's what's important, right?
Yeah, correct. So yeah, those were all the questions that I had for you, Clark, today. And I loved how you answered them all. And I am sure that whoever is going to watch this episode, they're going to find a lot of value and a lot of insights from this conversation. So yeah, it was great talking to you, and thank you so much for joining in. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Rutvij.